Hey, y'all. Welcome to the Book Marketing Mania podcast. I'm your host, Kim Stewart, and I'm so glad you're tuning in today. Y'all, I'm so thrilled today to welcome my friend and course student, Kristine Brown, to the podcast today. Kristine is the author of 2 books, including her recent one, Cinched, Living with Unwavering Trust in an Unfailing God. Kristine and I met several years ago in person at the She Speaks conference, and I've loved seeing her writing ministry grow from her blog to featured guest posts to speaking and to, of course, writing 2 books and now guesting on podcasts. She's a ministry wife, a mom, a stepmom, and a Mimi. As a former chronic worrier, Kristine loves connecting today's woman with women of the Bible. So guesting on podcast was a natural fit for Kristine to reach listeners and share her God-given message. So Kristine joined my podcast pitching 101 mini course last year, and I've been jumping for joy as she's put her strategy in place and started pitching herself to be a guest on podcast. So imagine my delight when she pitched me the idea for today's show and wanted to serve you all by sharing 5 lessons she learned from her first 5 podcast interviews. So if you have any questions or worries about pitching yourself, like, how do I keep track of everything? What happens if something goes wrong with my tech? How do I prepare for an interview? What if I mess up or wish I'd said things differently? How can I learn about the show and host before pitching? How can I keep from getting overwhelmed by all that goes into podcast pitching? Is there a magic time to pitch podcast? How will I know when my interview will air? Do I need to send a copy of my book to host? Y'all, Kristine answers all these questions. We don't call this Book Marketing Mania for nothing, so let's get to it. Hey, Kristine, welcome to the Book Marketing Mania podcast. I am so glad you're here today.
Hi, Kim. I'm excited to be able to sit down with you and talk about these things with your community.
Me too. So I know we're going to talk all about you using the book marketing strategy of guesting on podcasts to reach new readers. So first, will you just share with us a little bit about your most recent book and who your target listeners would be?
Sure. My most recent book is called Cinched, Living with Unwavering Trust in an Unfailing God. And it follows the journey of Rahab through the Bible and how from her story we can learn to move to a new level of trust in the God that we know and that is faithful to us through it all. And so starting with this book, my target reader is that woman who walks into church and just feels like she has spent her entire week worrying over something that she already gave to God. And she feels defeated because when she comes in again, she cannot get past this thing. She just can't seem to give God full control of the difficult circumstances that she's going through. And that's something that I went through myself. And Rahab also is a perfect example of that. So when I wrote this book, I was hoping to reach that woman and let her know that it is possible for us to trust God like we mean it, and for us to completely have dependence on Him and to enjoy that dependence that we have on our Creator.
Oh, I love that so much. And I know, you have certainly walked the walk that you're now sharing with your readers and listeners. And I can't think of any podcast that reaches Christian women today that wouldn't want to hear your message, and men too as well. Okay, so let's dive in. As I mentioned in the intro, that Kristine has been one of my students in my podcast pitching 101 for authors mini course. And so it helped her kind of jumpstart her podcast outreach. Kristine, I'm going to let you share 5 lessons you learned from your first 5 podcast interviews. And I may share a little bit, and then I definitely have questions to ask of you afterwards. So I'm going to let you take the mic.
Oh, thanks, Kim. Yes, absolutely. Jump in anytime because you are my expert, my go-to expert for podcast pitching. I was definitely a reluctant podcast guest. I like things the way I like them. I guess you can just put it that way. And I don't like change. So I was definitely resistant to the idea of pitching someone thinking, what is it about my message that they would want to hear? But through your course, I did learn some things along the way, and I took some notes, and I'm just happy to be able to share those things with your listeners and with your community today. The first one seems like very simple thing, but I didn't think about it before the first time I had my podcast interview, and that is to have a backup technology plan handy.
Oh, yes.
And yes, so important. And I really didn't think about it. And you know me, I'm an over planner.
Mm-hmm.
So of course I spent the entire day before making sure my microphone was set up and my camera and my lighting and everything was just so. And my very first interview, 10 minutes before, I turned on my computer and the camera was completely black. I couldn't see myself. I couldn't see anything. And my microphone wasn't working. Well, I knew this was something that I could troubleshoot and fix, but of course I'm thinking, well, I just spent an entire day setting this up. What could have happened? And I had no idea. So I had to get on the interview on my phone quickly and offer my apology, of course, to the host and tell her that I was going to have to set something else up really quickly. And she was very gracious, but that taught me that I needed to have something else there, maybe my phone, an extra microphone, a charger, whatever I need, that if something did happen, that I would have a backup plan in place.
Yeah, that's such great advice. Hey, and will you share, Kristine? Because I know, everybody has different setups for guesting on podcasts. Some people, they've never even started. So they're trying to figure out, can I even do it, with my phone and headphones? And I know sometimes a host will actually give you, specifics on that, what they want for their own show. But, and I know some people are hosts, right? If they're already a podcast host, they may have a little bit more sophisticated equipment, especially if they've been podcasting for a long time. But will you speak into that a little bit? Because I'm sure that is probably a lot of people's hesitations in the beginning is, oh my gosh, I have to have all this fancy equipment. And you really don't. I mean, as long as you have at least, it's great. Like it's a bonus, I think, for a host to have a microphone, but you don't even really have to have that. You can, as long as you have a good set of headphones with a microphone built in, I think is what they call that. But will you speak into that a little bit, just because you have been so fresh on pitching and guesting what you've been hearing and what you've done yourself?
Yes, absolutely. And exactly what you just said. Most of the hosts have said, as long as you have a set of earbuds that have the microphone attached, like something you would get with your smartphone when you purchase it, that is perfectly fine, that works well. I think maybe 4 out of my 5 hosts of the first 5 pitches that I made said that. And so that's something that, if you think about it, most of us have handy or could pick up at the local store pretty easily. And so don't let that be an excuse. You have everything you need. I just use my laptop, and then I do have a phone and a lapel mic. That was my backup plan that I used in that first interview. I don't use the lapel mic often, although it's something that many of us use, like to do Facebook live videos and things like that. I do have a stand mic that's not designed specifically for podcasts, but I just researched and found something that had good reviews, and it's a very inexpensive, economical thing. And so I would say that you don't have to have all the bells and whistles podcast mic. Although if you want to continue, that would be good to invest in. It's an investment in the process, but so simple is okay.
Yeah, I think it sounds great. So your microphone that you're talking about is one that does plug into your laptop, right?
Yes, correct.
Like a USB mic. Great. Yeah, I think it sounds wonderful. Okay, so number 1 lesson you've learned is have a backup technology plan handy. What about number 2?
Number 2 is whatever resources the host offers in order for you to prepare for the interview, take advantage of them. I was amazed at how many things the host had taken the time to write and provide for their guests. And a lot of them will post it on their website and give you a link or send you as a PDF in an email. So I would say read over those things. Many of the hosts provide a list of sample questions, and some will even ask you to provide questions for them. So do all of those things. That information is invaluable when you're preparing, and it helps you to feel more comfortable when you're sitting down with the host. You feel like you've gotten to know her a little bit already, and that just helps the conversation to flow even better.
Yeah, there are some hosts that really have their acts together, and they've been doing it a long time, and that they have they just have lots of experience under their belts. They want to make sure the guest shows up to serve in the best way possible. And it's a great experience for the both of you, right? I mean, you're investing your time to guest on podcasts. You want it to sound as good as it can and to follow any host rules that they have about, here's things we are going to talk about. I know some of them have some set questions they ask at the end, and it's so nice to get those ahead of time because sometimes it's on the fly and they want it to be on the fly, but sometimes it's nice to get ahead of time because I know I don't work real well on the fly. So, it's great. Okay. So number 2 is whatever resources the host offers to prepare for the interview, take advantage of them. That's such a great tip. Okay, Kristine, what is your third lesson learned?
My third lesson is probably the one that I will continue working on for a long time. I don't know if I'll ever get to that place where I've completely got it, but it's this: you won't say everything exactly right, and that's okay. Pray about it before and don't second guess yourself after. That is something that I think that we will all experience at some time or another. And I think it comes from a place of having a really good heart, because when we're representing our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, and as faith-based people, we want to represent him well. And so we want to make sure our message comes across in the right way. And we feel like we need to clarify and explain. But in my book, one thing that I say that was a lesson that I've had to learn over and over again is that if I ask the Holy Spirit to guide me, I need to trust that he's doing it. So he can use my words. He will give me the right words to say, and he can reach that right person who needs my message in the moment with those words. So take a deep breath, pray, and don't second guess yourself.
Yeah, that's a great tip for sure. I know I struggle with that myself, Kristine. And there's, that you get done with the interview, there's so many things that go through your mind. You're like, oh, I forgot to say this, or, oh, this sounded so silly. But I think, your heart comes through on it for sure. And that's what the listeners are going to remember. They're not going to think, oh, she didn't say X, Y, Z, or that sounded different than the way I would have said, or, anything. They're just so appreciative of the information you come to share. So so number 3, you won't say everything exactly right, but that's okay. Pray before and don't second guess yourself after. Amen to that. Okay. What about lesson number 4?
Lesson number 4 is based on your mantra, Kim, for the Book Marketing Mania podcast, which is service over selling. And I love having that idea in my mind going into the interview. But at first I thought about service over selling as serving the host's community, the listeners of the podcast. And I just wanted to make sure that people understand that service over selling goes for the host too. So that is my 4th tip. The service over selling goes for the host too. And by that, I mean that I don't think we realize how much time and resources the host is putting into this podcast. And it's an opportunity for me to be able to share my message and share about my book with an entirely new audience of listeners. And the host is having to use her own finances, maybe to outsource some of the editing and the things, or maybe she's doing it herself and she's having to put that time and energy into creating this podcast episode. So I think it's important for us to show our appreciation in some way. Financially, if you can swing it, I would say to bless them in some way. And I have to say, this little tip I heard from Kathy Lipp on one of her podcast episodes was that if you're going to bless the host, that goes beyond just giving a copy of your book. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a good tip because I'm sure podcast hosts get a lot of books and like us, maybe have a huge stack that they still haven't read, but maybe add something in with that, like an e-gift card for a cup of coffee or a little $5 gift card for a treat at Sonic or something that you think that she might like or she might enjoy. And financially, if it's not possible, a nice thank you note would even be great. I think just something to show her that you appreciate the time that she put into letting you share your message with her.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I totally agree that you're showing up to serve the audience, right? But you are showing up to serve the host. And I think of it as a speaking event and that, the hosts are they put together a speaking event, right? And you're coming to be the speaker, and they've gathered all the people together. They've done all the hard work, and you just show up to serve and serve well, and you've done your job, but you want to definitely, do something. I think a note in the mail is incredible. Like, don't even worry about spending money, but I also think hosts would probably tell you, as long as you share the interview, like, oh my gosh, that is such a gift to a podcast host. And I'm so surprised how many people don't. I keep hearing that over and over, and it just really surprises me that people don't share their interviews. So definitely share your interview and definitely thank the host. So I love that tip of service over selling, making sure that it goes for both the listeners that you're showing up to serve as well as the host that you're showing up to serve. And you never know where that relationship may go. I'm sure you've probably seen that, Kristine. I mean, just some of the really great people that you meet that host podcasts, and you always stay in touch afterwards, and you just never know where that relationship might go on down the line of referring people to each other. They might refer you to another podcast, or, as writers, you might collaborate on something in the future. You just never know. So I love that tip on service over selling. So that goes for the host too. And so what about your tip number 5?
Well, number 5 is related to a little bit to what you said about thinking of it as a speaking event. I had spoken so many times before, but I didn't get that connection. When I started podcast pitching, I was thinking about this audience as this vast group of people out there that I couldn't see and had no idea how they were responding to my message. And I started thinking of the interview as speaking not just to the host, but also to that one person who needs my message. And that's something that as writers, a lot of us learned early on from those who had gone before us. Those multi-published authors have always given the advice that if you want to really reach your audience, speak to that one person, write to that one audience member, that one woman who needs your message. And I think we can think of our podcast interviews the same way. If I'm sitting down, having a cup of coffee, having a conversation with the host, this other woman is there too, and she's included in our conversation. So I need to think of it as I'm not just speaking to the host, but I'm speaking to that one person who needs my message.
Oh, that's beautiful. Because it is hard to remember when you're thinking of speaking to an audience and, an audience of listeners. But when you're on this one-on-one with your podcast host, I think that's a good tip because, oftentimes your podcast host is probably your target reader too. If they've gathered together your target readers, they're probably one of them too. So it's kind of nice to think about that conversation as representing your one reader. So I love that tip of think of your interview as if you're speaking to not only the host, but also that one person who needs your message. And so, Kristine, you said those are your 5 lessons learned, but you also had a bonus one you learned. Would you like to share that too?
Oh, absolutely. This is my bonus tip. And if I could, I'd probably bump this one up to the top. Before you ever send your first pitch, have a system for keeping track of everything. You think you'll remember, but you won't. And that just goes for all of us because you may already even be connected with this host through Instagram. You may already be following her, or you may have already reviewed the podcast in the past. And it's nice to have a place to keep track of these things, keep track of your pitches and all of the ways that you've connected with this wonderful host. And I use the spreadsheet that you provide in your Podcast Pitching 101 course. And what's great about this spreadsheet is that I could change it up and tweak it a little bit to make it my own, add columns into it. And before I ever pitch, I open this thing up and I review over it. I have all of my information there organized in one place.
Yeah, it helps so much whenever you want to do follow up. And like you said, you want to add in, just extra little things of points of contact you've made with the host. And I love connecting anything that collecting any kind of connection points, like they're a mom, their wife, how many kids they have dogs, have they just been on a vacation? Do they have a book coming out? I mean, that would be an incredible thing to be able to mention to a host. And when you've listened to a certain episode, make a note of it and you can jot it down and mention it to them in the future. So I love Google Sheets. It makes it super easy. I know I've used Trello before if you want to keep track of it as more of a project management system and other project management systems, but I really like just the super easy, quick glance Google Sheet to know where you're at. I've sent out a certain number of posts and this is the status that they're at. So those are great tips. Hey, y'all, my podcast pitching 101 for authors mini course that we're talking about is a 6-lesson video course along with the Google Sheet Kristine mentioned to help you kickstart your own outreach and pitch yourself as a guest to podcast host. You can check it out at bookmarketingmania.com/pitching101. And I'll also put a link here in your podcast player and in your show notes on the blog. So now let's get back to our conversation with Kristine. I want to ask you a couple of more questions just about your pitching journey to help our listeners that may or may not be pitching themselves today. So let's talk about a little bit more about service over selling. So we've talked about kind of showing up for the interview and serving the host and the listeners well. But before you even get to that point, I know we talk about in the course, service over selling begins like long before your pitch, where you're building relationships with those hosts so that hopefully you're not sending a cold pitch. Sometimes you do, you might find a new show and you may just go ahead and send a cold pitch out, but hopefully we're warming it up a little bit so that the host knows we really truly do care about coming to serve their listeners. So have you done anything to do that in ahead of your time of your pitches? And have you found any ideas that you could share that have been successful for you?
I think one of the most important things is to become a listener of the podcast. If this is a podcast where I feel like my message will fit, then likely, like you said before, the host and I already have a lot in common. And I am going to enjoy listening to her interviews with other guests. So I would say become a listener, really just enjoy that time that you have connecting with her. It's like you're getting to know a new friend. And that's the way I like to think of the podcast that I listen to. I can plug them in whenever I'm going for a walk or if I'm driving in the car. There's lots of opportunities to listen. And I like to kind of do things in chunks. So if I come across 3 different podcasts that I really like, I'm going to focus in on those. I'm going to listen for a while. Then I can review the podcast and even, like you said, take notes about some things that I've heard that resonated with me that are a connection point for my message. And then I can have something that I can spin off of if I think, well, my message would resonate with her audience in this way. I could connect to what she spoke about with this other guest, and then it makes sense. And it's not like you're just pitching someone out of the blue with someone just hoping that it might be something that they would like to have on their show.
Yeah, that's such a great tip. And that reminded me of something that I did definitely want to ask you, as I know we've talked about in the past, is just the time management of it. Also, we talked about the Google Sheet tracking where you are at with your pitches and what kind of follow-up you've done. But talk a little bit about, because I know you're really good about setting boundaries with your time. And so I think you kind of went into this with a certain aspect of you were going to spend a certain amount of time or like take a certain number of podcasts to start pitching. So can you share, because I know that's another thing that people kind of shy away from, is they think, oh my gosh, this is just going to be so time intensive. And I just don't have time to do it.
Right. It feels like it could get overwhelming at first. And so I think that is important to pray and set your own limits for yourself on what you feel like you can do and still enjoy it. I think that's important, that it's something that you enjoy doing. And I think of it a lot like guest blog posts, and people, when they're guest posting for other people's websites or writing devotionals, I always kind of set limits on myself for what I would do there. And I think of a podcast interview as the amount of time I would spend writing a guest blog post for someone for their website. So that's why I decided, and just really for my own peace of mind, to be able to really genuinely connect with someone and keep up with it and not get overwhelmed. I have a tendency to get overwhelmed. And knowing that about myself, now I can say I have got to stick to these boundaries so that I can be the best I can be and also offer my message in the best way possible.
Yeah, that's so great. And I know like Tammy Herzig is another client that I've had that has done pitching, and we did a VIP day together. So I put together her list of podcasts to go reach out to. And she's kind of done it with like, okay, I'm just going to set aside time every Tuesday to work on podcast pitching. So either that's relationship building or drafting her pitches or sending her pitches out or following up. She's just kind of blocked aside some time. And I think that's so great because she's speaking and do other things like you do. just to not let it be overwhelming. Like, again, you really want to get out and serve listeners. But I know during like a heavy book launch, sometimes you might be pitching out a little bit more. But I think for Tammy and for yourself too, and for lots of others, it's more of an ongoing visibility strategy. So you're not trying to do all of them in 1 week or 1 month or anything. You're just going to go on and on and on serving new listeners. So talk about your pitching strategy, Kristine. Have you been pitching through emails or through DMs or a mix of both?
I've only done pitches through emails. And one thing I discovered, well, I kind of knew this going in, that I have that professional email. And like many writers, you've got your professional email and then you have your personal email. And my professional email is notorious for being filtered into spam or junk folders just because it has the name of my website in there. And that's just the nature of it. It happens. So because of that, sometimes I use my personal email, but in that I will say, if you get an email from me at this email address, this is also me, just something along those lines. So they'll know and be aware that professional email is there. I did have that happen before and followed up. And then in the follow-up, the pitch was accepted. And I know that you mentioned before, sometimes that happens and a host will say, oh, I missed this email completely. I'm so glad you reached out again. But I have only pitched through emails. I have made connections with people through direct messages that I have not pitched yet, but I just felt like, and that maybe my personality a little bit, that I feel like the email is a little bit more professional when I'm reaching out, and it is a little bit of a business partnership because it is their business and yours as well. So I like to be personable, but still professional.
Yeah, I like that. I know that I've heard before from some like really big podcasters and influencers that have said, oh, just pitch me in the DMs. And I always feel like what they're really wanting to do is just make a connection in the DM. Like they're wanting to probably just sell you something in the DMs. So I always avoid that. But I don't mind reaching out through the DMs. Like if you're wanting to find out, do they have a guest submission form, or, you could just ask a simple question like that. But I'm the same way. I like it in email because I think it's easier to keep track of on both sides, right? But definitely, yeah, keep track of your own spam as well, because I know my pitches sometimes will end up in spam. And that's what happens is when I follow up, the host will be like, I never saw it. Or now that I went and looked, I found it in my spam. So they're always so gracious when they reply. But I know just in the last week or two, I've found some responses in spam that I didn't realize were there. So when I followed up, they had when they sent me back the next reply, it came in my inbox for some reason, but for some reason, the first response hit spam. So it's both sides. Be sure and check your spam. I know I think I've done a lot to try to make sure mine doesn't get filtered that way, but it still does. So it happens for sure. What about on as far as like the topics you've been pitching? Because I know obviously you have a recent book out. You also have another book, and I know your personal journey through cancer. I know, being a mom, a wife, you've been in ministry with your husband, you've been a teacher. I mean, there's so many facets to Kristine Brown. I'm just curious, like whenever you went into pitching, did you ever think you were pitching one topic and then maybe as you looked into the show, you realized, oh, they've already covered something similar to this, so I need to kind of pivot and pitch a different topic?
Well, I've really worked hard to make sure when I pitch that it is something unique to what they have shared recently on the show. And that's not to say something else couldn't come out before mine that was similar, but I try to make sure that if they have something similar that I would adjust it and give it a unique angle. So I haven't had that experience yet where I've had to change, but I did have one host that asked for a couple of different ideas. So I had like 3 different ideas, and then she picked the one that she liked the best. So that was good too. And through your podcasting course, I kind of went through my book and picked out like 3 different chapters that I could focus on with ideas and made some notes on those. So I have a starting place. When I sit down, I'm not starting from scratch every time, but I can see, is this relevant to her audience, whether it's something to do with health or something to do with a certain topic in the Bible or things like that. I can see if I already have something that's related to that would work, that she would enjoy having on her show.
Yeah, that's so great. I think just being flexible and like you said, doing your research ahead of time is so helpful. And I think just, I'm big on, don't do like a cookie cutter pitch approach, like you really want to personalize it. And, and sometimes we go in with like, here's kind of our one main topic, but here's lots of talking points and topics underneath that. Sometimes it is like what you just said, you want to just offer up several different topics and let the host decide because they know, we can look at what's been published, but they know what's coming up in the next several months. And we don't always have we're not as privy to that information. So I appreciate when host will share that with us. So on obviously you've gotten several yeses because you've obviously recorded 5 interviews for sure, maybe more. Have all your yeses to invites to be on a show, have they all come from your first email or have you had to do follow up on those?
So far, each and every one of the emails that I've sent were accepted on the first email. But with that being said, I just want to say that I don't feel like that was anything particularly that I have done to make that happen. I'm not sure that there's a specific trick that I could say that you need to do in order to be accepted without the follow-up. But I do feel like that the time of year that I was pitching, which I didn't realize going into it, I was just pitching because I was about to be releasing a book and I wanted to have this as part of my strategy, part of my marketing plan. But so many of the hosts were saying the same thing. They were saying, oh, right now I'm batch recording for next spring. So it just so happened that I hit it at the right time. And I just believed that that was a God thing. So they were all in a season of recording. And that was a lesson for me that hosts also probably batch produce a lot of them so that they can have their recordings out for a few months. And I'll remember that so that next year when I get right around to that, and just for listeners, that was right around fall. It was like September, October time. And I'll plan on pitching again. So who knows, as I get into it, I'm still new. And there may be times of year that the hosts will say, this is not the right time, or I'll be recording later on in the year or whatever. But so far I've had good success with them accepting after the first email pitch.
Yeah, that's so great because it's kind of all over the board, right? I mean, sometimes you can get them back really fast and then sometimes you don't hear anything. And so I know like probably 30 to 40% of our yeses have come from a follow-up email. And it's usually the host is like, oh my gosh, I've just been so busy and I haven't gotten back to you. Or, it could be that it would landed in spam. And I'm so glad you talked about the turnaround time because I do think it's so important to be thinking, as you got books coming out is when you're thinking about maybe pitching yourself or just throughout the year, like Kristine's doing, just, not setting a certain deadline. It's just like throughout the year, you're going to encourage listeners is as you're building those relationships, it's so much easier to reach out and maybe they would slide you into their content calendar because we don't know. I know like one client I pitched last month, I think the host was scheduling it for January, but it wasn't going to air until like either May or June. So it's been so crazy. So is that what you've seen kind of with the different hosts? Have you seen a lot of variety in when their content calendars are?
Yes. And to me, that is such a blessing because I think we've all learned that it's so much less about the actual one book launch now and it's more of a long-term marketing plan. Mm-hmm. So we're planning for our books to be marketed long-term. And this is great to think that I can record a podcast interview today and it may not air for 6 months. That's something 6 months from now that's going to be there that I don't have to do, honestly. Yeah. So, yes, I've had everything from it will air at the end of this month to it will air next spring or summer or whatever. So usually the host will give a time frame, not a specific date, but like a time for a 2-week time frame, sometime between these dates or sometime around these dates. So I'll know when to watch for it. And then I just, make sure I'm actively checking social media so that I can see those tags because like you had mentioned before, the host will always tag. And so I tried to do my best to share those things with my audience as well.
Yeah, that's so great. I just listened to, I think it was last week's episode on the self-publishing school. I don't know if you listened to that podcast with Chandler Bolt. So good. But he was sharing, he's going through a relaunch. He was just talking about podcast interviews being such a great evergreen asset for authors. And I had never really heard that term before used for podcast guesting, but it's so true because it is. You just record it once and it can be, it can show up any time of the year, but it's going to keep showing up and keep showing up. People are going to keep listening to it. And, new listeners are always going to find it. And then you could turn around and do something with that content, but it is something evergreen that sits there. So that was my other question I was going to ask you too. And I think you maybe have already answered it, but have the hosts let you know ahead of time when the episode's going to air, or is it more the day of you get tagged on social and you realize it's gone live?
Usually right when we finish the interview, the host will say, you can expect this to come out sometime around XYZ date. Mm-hmm. So they'll tell you pretty much if they have a time frame and let you know. And most of them really are organized and do it well in advance. Mm-hmm. So that's good too. So yeah, they let me know when to kind of watch for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've definitely noticed with COVID, people are batching way ahead of time because, gosh, that certainly took everybody by surprise when all the kids came home and all the podcasters couldn't podcast. So I think everybody's gotten a lot smarter about batching ahead of time for sure. So yeah, if you have a book coming out, make sure you reach out to a podcasting friend of yours and just kind of give them a heads up and ask them if they, if there's any time on a content calendar in the next year that you might could support their listeners, and then you could offer something in return. I know like one of our hosts that we reached out to was full through the spring, and then they have their own book coming out. So they were kind of shifting their podcast content towards that. So that's kind of nice to know also, because that, then you can offer, hey, well, I'd love to share about your book as well with my community. And if you're a host, you could offer a swap, but if not, you could say, I'll share it in my email list or on social media. And just, again, goes back to that service over selling that Kristine was talking about, making sure we serve the host as well. So the other thing I was going to ask you too, Kristine, being a self-published author, have the host asked for a book in advance? Because I know typically like with traditional publishing, they'll send those out in advance to hosts. They kind of have their system, within the publisher. But I was curious if any hosts have asked you to get the book in advance of your interview.
So far, it's been about half and half. Mm-hmm. About half have asked for it and half have not. So that, that's been an interesting thing, a learning point for me as well, is that just the difference in hosts in their processes and their personalities. Some like to read the book in advance so that they can have a conversation about some specific things in the book. And others haven't mentioned it at all. But one thing, some advice that you gave me that I have felt like was just so crucial was not to always feel like I'm talking about the book, to focus on my message. And if there's something in the book that I want to mention, that's great, but the message that's going to bless the reader. And then the book is like an extra resource if they would like to go deeper into the message.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great point, Kristine. And yeah, I think what I've seen is almost every single host will ask at the end anyway, tell us about your book, or how can we learn more about your book, or maybe a free resource you have to offer. And so, yeah, there's always a chance to give a little plug to your book. But I love that you shared that, because that is, there are podcasts that are specifically about books, right? You would specifically go on to talk about your book. But I think when you're pitching a host is, making sure that we don't lead with the book, that we're going to lead with the message that we're going to give value to our listeners. So this has been awesome, Kristine, you sharing all your lessons that you've learned through your interviews. And I just love hearing you talk about guesting, and especially hearing your interviews go live and being able to share those. So I want to ask you one last question for any of our listeners that are maybe new to podcast guesting, and they might be thinking like what you shared in the very beginning. They might be thinking, who wants to listen to me share my message? Or, who's going to ask me to be on their podcast? I would love for you to just maybe speak a little truth into them and encourage them that they too have a message to share.
Oh, so much advice. First of all, I think that I would definitely say you are not alone. And when we think about ourselves as a podcast guest, I like to flip the script a little bit and think of myself as the listener. What do I enjoy about a podcast? And the podcast interviews that I've enjoyed the most are the ones where the guest genuinely shared about her life, her testimony, what God has done for her, her message. And so I think that we feel this need to say something profound when all we really need to do is just to be ourselves. So that would be my advice. Don't feel like you have to come up with something profound to say, to feel like you have something to say. All you need to do is be yourself.
That's such great advice. Well, thank you so much, Kristine. Tell our listeners where they can connect with you online.
Probably the best place to connect with me is at my website, KristineBrown.net. It's Kristine with a K. And I am also on Instagram and Facebook, but my website is the place where they can find all the resources that I have available. And the best place to connect with me is there.
Okay, that sounds great. We'll be sure and put a link in the show notes. Well, thank you so much for serving our listeners today, Kristine. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Kim. I had so much fun.
Y'all, isn't Kristine the best? If you're a podcast host, run, don't walk to book her as your next guest, as she'd love to share lessons learned from women in the Bible with your listeners. Her lessons were all spot on today. And y'all, after recording my first 8 guest interviews, I just have to second her lesson number 3. You won't say everything exactly right, and that's okay. Holy cow. After almost every interview I've done, I ended and remembered something I said and wanted the host to take it out, or wish I would have added something, or just phrased something a little differently. But hey, God's got this, right? So if you are ready to kickstart your own podcast outreach to pitch yourself as a guest, be sure to check out my Podcast Pitching 101 for Authors mini course at bookmarketingmania.com and then click on course. Thanks for tuning in today, and I'll see you in 2 weeks to help you market your book one podcast at a time.